So, welcome back. I hope you enjoyed the lunch. I definitely did. It was nice to get to interchange some more ideas more informally than within this one-to-one framework. So, our next speaker is Professor Charlie Beckett. It's my pleasure to introduce him. Professor Beckett works on the Department of Media and Communications at the London School of Economics, where he's the founding director of Polis, the international journalism think tank of this organization. He was previously the director of the LSA's Truth, Trust and Technology Commission that reported on the misinformation crisis in 2018. And he was also an award-winning filmmaker.
Yeah, at least one. At least one
award. So now Professor Beckett is leading the Police Journalism and Artificial Intelligence project that has been working with news organizations and journalists all around the world to see how this new technology is changing the way news are produced and consumed. You might know, you might have read the report of 2023, published in 2023, that is quite a benchmark for all of us, and I mean all of us because we are almost all of us working some way or another with artificial intelligence. So it's this benchmark to see how generative artificial intelligence, is being used by news media and how this technology will ultimately shape the routines of information production, distribution, and consumption. So without further ado, Professor Beckett, you can start now.
Thank you very much. And it is great to be here. I thought the presentations this morning were absolutely fascinating. And it kind of reminds us, obviously, that there's this big kind of cliff that we think we're going to fall off, or this big storm that we think is coming. But from looking from outside at least, you know, I look at the way that you're addressing this, and I look at the resources that you've got, and it's, let's not give up yet. It's very encouraging. And I speak as somebody who did work for a regional broadcaster. I once worked for London Weekend Television, which bizarrely, can you imagine this? There was a company that made television just for the weekend and just for London. There was another company that did it during the week. And of course, that company does not exist anymore. But it wasn't killed off by technology. It was killed off by that whole consolidation of ITV into a single unit. And yet the regional identity of ITV, for example, ITV News, is still incredibly strong. Some of the most popular news programs in the UK are still the regional news. So it's great to be amongst you people. And I think obviously you've got incredible, the range across your network. You do have that kind of perhaps a moat that you hid behind, which is mainly language, but also culture and nationality. And you can feel that the fortress is becoming less strong, if you like. And it's just very, very encouraging to see people responding like you are today. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk you through partly what I've been doing with this journalism AI project, which is very global. We're trying hard not to be too Western centric. And we've been working on this since 2018. So we got in on AI when AI was really boring, but it was doing really interesting things. It was obvious to me that it was, if you like, the next kind of wave of technological disruption or change and so on, and therefore we needed to pay attention to it. And since then, we've created a load of programs, including the Journalism AI Fellowship, where people are working together on innovation around these problems. And I'll talk more about what we've been doing, but it's all online. We have a festival every year where the people talk about what they've been doing with us, and there are other people, experts talking about what we can do. So that was going very nicely, and then generative AI happened. So we were quite comfortable with old-fashioned AI, and then boom, whenever it was 18 months ago, suddenly that chat GPT, etc., was unleashed. And we decided, we'd done a big survey in 2018. We decided to do a fresh survey asking people about generative AI and AI in general. What were they doing with it? And what did they think about it as well? And it was a bigger survey this time. It doesn't pretend to be representative, it's a sample, but we managed to talk to more than 100 organizations in nearly 50 countries. So I think it gives a kind of broad flavor. And some of it was really unsurprising. Yes, during this last year, 2023, newsrooms around the world were experimenting with generative AI. And that could be everything from having a proper R&D process to some person in the room playing with ChatGPT. I think it's interesting that there are 14% who said, no, we've not touched it. I'm also unsure about the 1% who didn't know if they did or not. That person worries me slightly. But it was clear, this is so important, I think, that so much of the attention has been on, let's get ChatGPT to do something really crazy, you know, like pretend it's Adolf Hitler or something, to create content mainly. But that is, in many ways, the least useful thing that people told us about. But it does go right through the process. It's in news gathering, news production, and news distribution, which is the bit we keep forgetting about. So this is ubiquitous. And when something is ubiquitous in your business, you should be thinking about it in a ubiquitous or strategic way. You can see the number of different use cases, and this is just a little sample. You know, summarization, for example, of content is quite a good one. Experimenting on big data sets, again, we're familiar with that from investigative journalism, and people trying to do things which are a bit more kind of technical around data extraction and code development. They're just a little flavor. The point is that obviously, I think it's obvious anyway, that the people we spoke to see there's going to be more of this. And across the board again, thinking about fact checking, disinformation, personalization, text generation, audio generation, and then perhaps creating specific products such as chatbots. And chatbots are quite an interesting one, because do you remember chatbots? They used to be terrible. Just generally, if it was your airline or your electricity company or your newspaper had a chatbot, it was terrible. Please, can you help me? Hello, I don't know who you are. You know, it was awful. And they're getting much better. But interestingly, there's so much you can learn from them. Wouldn't you like to know what your readers want to know? Yes? Yes, of course you do, because then you might be able to answer their questions for them, not just on the chatbot, because the chatbot should just be an expression of your journalism. It should be based on your own data. So I think chatbots are really interesting in terms of reconfiguring a number of presentations this morning, talking about putting the user centrally, thinking about the user first. Never mind digital first, it's all about user first. Well, a chatbot is theoretically an opportunity to do that. But clearly, anybody that's tried to start tackling this technology, just like with social media, just like with going online, knows that there are all these challenges. We'll talk about some of the more ethical ones, but the biggest one is just the technical challenge, the financial constraints. Even with the best will in the world, I don't know many newsrooms that have got people sitting around doing nothing, waiting to be asked to look at AI. It's a choice you have to make to pay attention to it. And a lot of newsrooms have told us they're very worried about the ethical implications. The fact that even the people who create these large language models don't quite know why they're working so well, inverted commas. Then, of course, most of the newsrooms we spoke to, especially the public service ones, are very worried about reputational damage. They're worried that they're worried about transparency and accuracy and so on. And of course, more generally, they're worried about disinformation, for example, the declining trust that could cause. But generally speaking, I think the major concern was just how rapid this has happened, how rapidly this has been unleashed. And as you know, it's been unleashed not because it was ready, but because those companies like OpenAI were in deep competition with each other, and they are benefiting from having the tech out there. because the more that we use it, the better it will get. We are like the guinea pigs for those tech companies. And so, of course, this is, it's important to stress this is exacerbating many existing challenges, like the whole sustainability, the whole thing that regional broadcasters are waking up to, the fact that people are going elsewhere. So AI use cases, I mean, this is a really good one of how not to do it. I don't know if you're familiar with this one. It's the kind of comic book worst example. This was Sports Illustrated, the big American sports, or it used to be a big American sports magazine. They decided to use AI to generate content about sports. And when they did it, the content was unedited and it was full of mistakes. It was full of mistakes and things that were made up. It was really embarrassing. That wasn't bad enough. They decided to invent, using AI, they invented these journalists to pretend that journalists had written those articles. These are all fake people, generated by AI, fake images, fake people. So that was absolutely the classic way not to use AI. These are the better ways to approach those concerns if you're worried about those concerns. And the first one is, to advocate for transparency. We want to ask the tech companies to tell us more about how they created these tools. And then yourselves, you can build ethical guidelines. It's a really helpful process. I'll talk more about it in a second. You can think about using AI. We had a wonderful project that was using AI to remove human biases, because obviously it's not just the AI. We are all full of biases, sometimes good ones. And this idea of the human in the loop, that you never unleash this on its own. It's a bit like a really good intern, super clever, but you always want to make sure you check their work before it goes out to the public. And of course, there are going to be some tasks that you will want to keep AI free. One example I would suggest would be, what's the most important stories today for your news organization? I think that should be a human decision. You can't automate that. That's human judgment. Because sometimes the most important story isn't necessarily about the biggest issue. It could be something symbolic or an incredibly moving story, a human story that you think, that's the biggest story. And then finally, this idea, which I'll come back to, about collaboration, which obviously you're doing, collaborating with industry experts, with newsrooms, with universities, whatever, startups and so on. Because what is really obvious is that, and I'm sure you feel this, that not just regional news, but news as a whole is a tiny, tiny industry with very minimal resources to develop its own tech. And therefore, we cannot do this on our own. And you are wasting your time if you try and do it on your own, because meanwhile, the bad people will already be doing it. So this is from, what's his name, Judge Seward from the New York Times. The point here is that human decisions, all the mistakes I've seen with AI have been human mistakes. People who haven't bothered to vet the content that's created. They've been lazy. They've thought, well, that can do it for us. They haven't thought about what the reader really wants from your content. They've allowed dishonest or untruthful stuff to go out there. And they've not been transparent. By transparent, I don't just mean to the audience, but amongst yourself. Are you being honest about how you're using this amongst yourselves? So these are what I think are the key risks for news media. Generally, I mean, it's a risk, frankly, for beyond news media. And they apply, in a sense, to all sectors. The problem about discrimination around these technologies. We know, for example, that if you use this technology in recruitment, it tends to bias against ethnic minorities. We know about the problem around disinformation, and then we know about these legal issues around copyright. I don't know about your news organizations, but many are now blocking the large language, it's a bit too late now, but trying to block the large language models from using your content. And of course, other news organizations like Axel Springer and AP have actually been selling their data, making deals with the AI companies to use their content. So really big level strategic stuff. And then there are those kind of risks for news media as a practice. And these are big ones that we need to address. One is just depending on this technology. I mean, hands up anybody who pivoted to video with Facebook about 5 years ago. You know, Facebook said, yeah, come on, make video for us. And for about a year, it worked brilliantly. And then they changed their mind, they changed the algorithm, and suddenly, and the same is happening now. Those platforms are deprioritizing news. So this dependency, how we manage that is really important. It's one of the reasons why my project is sponsored by Google, the Google News Initiative. And one of the reasons I justify that is because I want to try and have some kind of conversation with these tech people. I want to sort of say, hey, remember us? We're the journalism people, you know? But the bigger problem is this idea of competition. And the people this morning spoke about this, although we don't really like to acknowledge it, which is that who is asking themselves today, why me? Why should the public come to us as public service broadcasters to get information or entertainment or anything? Why? Because it's so easy now technically. Streaming isn't just a convenience thing. You know, it's the whole experience, the UX experience for people is so much better, or until recently, anywhere else. And we've got to ask ourselves, what are we providing that the other people aren't? There's the competition. And then there's specific risks, of course, around things like inaccuracy, the threat to quality, the threat to the business model. But I think the biggest danger, and I'm very encouraged by this morning, the way that people at least starting to realize the structural shifts in our industry, the biggest danger, I think, is that we're going to be left behind. So you're all worrying about culture, you're worrying about the management. Well, great, lovely. Meanwhile, the bad people, or your competitors, they're already doing all this stuff, okay? They're using AI, and they're getting wonderful attention. So by the time you get your act together, it may be too late. I'm going to skip that one. And there are good reasons, there are positive reasons. It's not just because it's the latest shiny thing. There are huge efficiency gains to be had around using artificial intelligence. And to be honest, when I speak to executives, that's the main thing they focus on. They think, oh, good. This means that everyone's going to be producing more. It's going to be cheaper. Perhaps I can even lose some people over this. And of course, that's sad. But there are huge efficiency gains. The most obvious ones are in places like coding. I spoke to somebody doing coding in a newsroom in London for an international broadcaster, and he said it made him 80% more efficient. Now, even if it was 40%, you'd want to know about that, wouldn't you? Then there are going to be new tools, and I think this is a really interesting way to think about it. We tend to think about the big structural, systemic things, but what about things like translation, transcription, reformatting? The things that individual journalists are going to use. They're going to use it to go through huge, economic or scientific reports and need them summarized because that's their field. It can be helping to do that. So I think looking at the individual journalists, how they can be empowered by this is really important, as well as the new products and services. I mentioned chatbots. Obviously, personalization is incredibly important. Translation is really interesting when I think about the different languages that are present in your network. And of course, that's a two-way street. I thought it was fascinating, the presentation from Agalegos this morning, that you will be able to spread your content because you'll be able to translate it instantly. Fantastic. Unfortunately, so will everyone else. So suddenly you might find yourself swamped. Suddenly people can translate all their content into your language. So it'll be really interesting how that plays out. I think the local wins, but we'll see. Then there are loads of great ways to counter disinformation using AI. But this ultimate optimistic bit, and who wants optimism? Anybody want optimism? Yes? Thank you. Right. This is the optimistic bit, okay? So treasure this, okay? Take this back. The idea is that you can take the resources that you free up by using all this, and you can just sack people, or you can, save money and send it back to you don't have shareholders, but you know what I mean. Or you can say, okay, let's do some more constructive journalism. Let's do some more investigations. let's actually get our reporters out into Vigo to talk to people, to see what's actually going on, rather than just relying on online journalism. Because I think that's going to be the added value proposition for journalism generally, but especially, I think, for public service journalism. I expect from public service journalism, yes, you tell me about the weather, great. You tell me whether Celta Vigo won last night, that's nice. But actually, I can get that anywhere. What I'm really looking for is journalism that has human values, has judgment, analysis, it can explain things, but also it can understand my values, my identity, my feelings. And that's a human quality. So how do you do this? As I mentioned right at the beginning, I think that this is a strategic problem. I mean, I love the way that people like yourselves are thinking about this in a big picture way. This is about structural change. And I love the way that you're at least trying to address it in a strategic way. It's really tough. But I think this is how I think people should respond, certainly to generative AI and AI. The first thing is to get informed. And by that, I just mean a basic level of knowledge throughout your organization, right through from marketing to your presenters. Just know something about AI that isn't from a movie, okay? Just get some basic ideas. And again, on our website, there's lots of lovely introductions to this stuff. And the reason you need that basic information is because you are going to be using AI. You are already using AI. When you do a Google search, that's a form of artificial intelligence, machine learning. And you're going to be using a lot more of it. So that's good, right? You want to know about the tools you're using. But also, of course, anybody who's reporting on the world out there is going to be, AI is going to be part of the story, or quite often. The military, benefits, medicine, education, any story out there is increasingly going to involve AI. So for God's sake, if we can't report on it properly and critically and independently, then who will? I think it's so important. Now, there's a second idea of broadening AI literacy. What's the difference between that and information? Well, that means literacy for me means what can you do with this? And what shouldn't you do with this? What are the risks and what are the opportunities? So yeah, you told me about it, great, but what can I actually do? And I think that's very much a dynamic process because different people will do different things and find it useful or not useful. Assigning responsibility is so important. The idea that you've got to have, ideally, people, not a person, who is actively looking at these technologies. And by that I mean getting across all the developments, but also internally, perhaps ideally creating a network of people who are communicating around this. You call them what you want, an AI network, digital network, but then also beyond that, trying to identify good practice, trying to identify concerns that people have. And then if you do start to use AI, and I really do think that everyone should be experimenting. If you're not experimenting, then that's sad. And if you do find things that work, that's great, but then test them, iterate them again, and do it again in 6 months' time and review what you've done, because this is such a dynamic set of technologies. Draw up guidelines. Again, I'm really encouraged by a lot of news organizations around the world who have spent the last year drawing up guidelines around AI. I worked at the BBC for 10 years. I don't think I ever once looked at the BBC producer guidelines, but it was good to know they were there, and if something did go wrong, you knew where to go to. The same with this, that it's partly that you're trying to reassure your staff. You're trying to say, look, be careful, don't risk our reputation. These are the things you need to worry about. But it's also for your audience. It's saying, hey, we paid attention to this. We are not going to screw up. We're trying not to screw up. And the actual process of having that conversation, if you do it properly, I think is in itself a worthwhile thing to do. And then finally, this idea, of collaborating and networking. And just to end on a quick commercial break, just for the organization, people then say to me, well, what can we do about this? How can I, find resources to train my staff, etc.? How can I find more case studies? of all this? Well, it's all online, and all of this is free. We actually did, we're going to do a version of this in Spanish this year. We're also going to do a version of this in Arabic this year. We have an AI starter pack where you can explore things for yourself. We've got an Airtable with loads and loads of case studies. So if you're interested in one thing, you'll probably find something there. And finally, we have this huge network of like 11,000 people around the world. And we're doing this thing where we connect them on a Slack channel so you can try and talk to other people going through the same challenges that you're doing. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So we open the room for your questions. I'm sure there are going to be plenty.
Who's using AI?
We need artificial intelligence to make the same mistake as recycling the news.
As
Nick Davis recycling the news. Nick Davis in Flat
yeah.
almost 15 years ago actually found that 88% of all news published in British media had been recycled on that or other way.
Yeah.
And artificial intelligence actually just improving their possibility. But only 12% of the genuine news produced by the, let's say, accountable media, it is very poor share, actually, to say that journalism is healthy.
No, I agree completely. And I think the interesting thing about Nick's research, well, it's actually Cardiff University's research, but was that it doesn't mention the internet. You know, that was before the internet. We were doing all this recycling, and even in the wonderful programs that I work for, which of course were high quality public service programs, so much of what you do as a journalist is recycling. Even with the best journalism, you are very little of it is genuinely original. You know, you're reshaping stuff that is happening. You're getting agency footage, or you know, you're going to the same press conference as everybody else. And I wrote about this 15 years ago, that one of the biggest problems with journalism was we duplicate, that we're all basically doing the same stories. And that has been changing already, that increasingly news organizations realize they have to have a more distinctive approach, they have to add value. And I think AI will be the final flush of that toilet. Because what is the point? If I can use AI to do routine, bland, update me news, then why do you exist? Yeah? And I think the characterization of the 12% isn't quite right, but it's the other stuff. And we saw great examples this morning of, you know, like from Swedish TV about doing more thoughtful, constructive journalism. We actually spoke to somebody. I mean, I don't think that AI could have done that story about the deepfakes. It could have repeated it, but I don't think it could have originated it. You know, that took human empathy and a bit of investigation and context and sentiment to understand why it mattered. You know, I think AI could not have done that story. So I'll be honest, I think the bad news is that from this base, the news industry will shrink in the sense of, and it has been for the last 30 years because other people are providing that information, including the LSE. We have millions of people coming to our website to look at our podcasts and things. You know, perhaps they would have gone somewhere else before. They might have gone to journalists before to get that information. You know, journalists like me, I used to interview LSE professors. Now you can come direct to me. You know, so I'm being realistic. I'm not saying that it's all going to be beautiful, but I think obviously you've got to look at the 12%, and that is your purpose now.
Do we need new economic model? We should make it actually more rigorous entry conditions to be.
I think the funny thing about public service broadcasting is it's actually the model that everyone's now coming up with. It's very funny. You know, especially when you go to America. You go to America and they say, do you know what? What we need to do is get some like public funding, perhaps from taxation or perhaps for taxing the tech companies. And we should create these media organizations that really care about public service and authenticity and balance. You say, oh, that's great. Yeah, what a clever idea. If only we thought about that in Europe, you know. I don't want to be rude to Americans, but I think in that sense, and I keep saying this to politicians. And obviously, the point is politicians do not want your public service journalism. It really gets in the way. Yeah, the nice ones say they do, but they don't really. So we've got to fight for it, and we've got to fight for it by connecting to the public, making the case to the public. And you make the case best of all through the work that you do, not through those adverts. Democracy dies in darkness, blah blah. You make it through the work you do. And as I say, the work that you do best, especially when I think about whatever you want to call yourselves, regional, local, or just national public service, is being on the citizen side. And I think we've failed on that philosophy over the last 50 years.
There's a question there.
Yeah, what we have seen in the Scandinavian countries is that about 50% of the young audiences find their news stories from search, particularly Google. And now we have chatbots like Perplexity, who is actually treating the URLs for the companies like numbers, which means that who delivers the content isn't important.
Yeah.
So one of my questions is what is the space for news media when both Google changed the way they lift in search and services as Perplexity comes?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's a very difficult question. And I think you've got to relate it partly to user experience again. Why are the younger people doing that? Are they doing it because they're stupid? Are they doing it because they don't care about information? No, they're doing it because it works for them. And in many ways it works much better than having to, wait to the 7 o'clock news and sitting down and being told by somebody this is the most important stuff. They just don't accept that. They don't accept it as a convenience thing, but they don't accept it in a kind of a value sense. They want to have control over their or they want to feel they have more control over their informational experience. And I think the only way, so it's not just about the algorithms. It's not that they go on a particular platform and they are somehow disempowered. In some ways, they're empowered. People keep saying to me, we mustn't give people the news just because they're interested in it. We've got to give them something else. We shouldn't just give people stuff that they care about. And I just think that's crazy. Obviously part of a healthy news diet is to be surprised, to be challenged, and people will enjoy that too. That's one of the reasons why people sometimes at least enjoy social media, because they prefer it to. Our news is so predictable. Mainstream news is so predictable. They go on social media and it's less predictable, and they may enjoy that actually, and it pays much more attention to their interests. So how we get into that space, I'm really avoiding your question, but I think it's the usual stuff. It's, are we on those platforms? Please.
Maybe more precise. We were talking earlier about how we should make a more horizontal integration.
Yes.
But this means that we actually takes care of our brands, because that will in the end be our stronghold. What we do now is we depend on Google, we depend on Facebook, we depend on TikTok, we depend on everybody else to actually be the content deliverer, to have some kind of grasp with the audience. And if what we sit with in the next phase is Perplexity, it means that our content will never have the way back. We will be a number of a link, not a new URL anymore.
Yeah, I agree.
So the awareness of what we do now, we have been really into social media for a long time. And I could put it as a rhetorical question, more like, should we stop with that?
Yeah. No. This is getting slightly philosophical almost, but this idea, I don't even know David Casal's work on structured news. But this idea that we are effectively moving into an information environment where news is structured as data. And that's partly got production consequences, but it's certainly got consumption consequences. That the idea, and there's a bit of a contradiction going on here, because a lot of mainstream media at the same time is building paywalls, subscription models. It's creating a kind of moat to try and defend the brand, as you say. So when that brand then goes out into the wild world of the platforms and social media, at least that that's whatever brand it is, the BBC or something, and you retain. I think this is so important. You can have two things that can be true. You have to retain that institutional content, values, and production, which means having an institution called a public service media company, right? But you, as you said, you completely do not own the means to distribution. You can perhaps control it through subscriptions and so on. So, but your only hope with Perplexity is that the people who use Perplexity will value enough the better information or more interesting information that they get that's related to news companies. How that happens technically, I don't know. I don't know. Do you know? I don't know. I don't know how this. I mean, I could just say, but I just don't think that.
If you haven't seen the Perplexity, it's like a chatbot where you.
But it can't do, for example, it doesn't do.
What's the latest about?
Yeah.
And then it answers. And it answers with sources, but the sources are numbers.
Yeah.
This source has
So you're a footnote.
The answer has 3 sources.
Yeah.
And then you have to click on the numbers to actually be able to go to.
But that's not so different. That's not so different from Google snippets. People who look at the snippet and go,
but it means that we are.
I mean, I'm more worried about a Perplexity that doesn't have the footnotes. That's going to be the real problem. And then at that point, we start entering into a whole realm of copyright. And I hate the idea of copyright. I think we need to find a different term for that. About how we regulate. Again, I don't like the word regulate, but how we manage its competitive thing. Partly, you could see it as competition law. They don't have a right to use your content to compete with you. That might be a way of looking at it. Meanwhile, I mean, I don't know how many people use Perplexity. I think the difficulty of making it so topical as a news organization, the ability of a news organization is partly also to say, this is something that's important, you need to know. I think the on-demand thing is incredibly important, but people have to know what the question is, And I think there's going to be a much better relationship between journalists and the public, will be in terms of saying, here's something that's happened, what do you need to know? Perplexity isn't able to do that. You as journalists are able to say, here's something that's really interesting, this is why we think it's interesting, what do you need to know about this? So I think that kind of relationship Perplexity can't have. Not everything's going to be on demand. There is still a great desire for, there are still people who, go and see a movie without really knowing what it's about, that kind of thing. There's still a huge appetite for you going to them. And I'm talking about beyond journalism here, But God, that's a good question.
I heard one of our meetings in Circle, a Dutch colleague representative in the Circle, that there's a consensus in the Netherlands that they are not allowing generated AI for newsrooms, for journalism. Do you think this should be a standard for everywhere? And just because I heard something about that in your slides here, that the newsroom task you shouldn't work with AI.
It's a kind of meaningless thing to say, because they are. I mean, they are. There'll be people using, well, certainly AI generally. Like I just said, you could argue Google search is a form of AI, and even generative AI. I mean, what if somebody uses ChatGPT to try out different headlines? You know, can you suggest some stuff for me? Is that to be banned? You know, I think it's, I've seen most of the guidelines I've seen, and this includes universities, you know, where I work. My department has a policy that you should not use generative AI for students, right? And then it says, unless, unless you are transparent. You say, I've used it for this, 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 and this. And these are the results we got, you know? And I think it's the same with news. I mean, I'm not arguing that everyone should be using generative AI all the time. As you can hear, I see it mainly as an enabling thing for people to do better human journalism. And I think there are loads of examples of where you shouldn't use it. And the most obvious thing is that AI does not know anything. You shouldn't use it to fact check directly. You shouldn't use it to source facts directly as your sole source, because we know it gets things wrong. You know, it's very good at summarizing stuff. If you give it a text and say, can you make that shorter or longer or something, that's quite good at that. It's good at translating things, it's good at transcribing things. It's good at offering ideas. It's good at, you know, if you give it as, like I said, a complicated report, it's actually surprisingly good. I'm really amazed actually at how it doesn't seem to make so many mistakes like that. So when you ask it more of an open question, then it goes a bit doolally. So I think prescribing it is usually just a kind of precaution. It says don't use it, but. And I think the danger of that policy is that for sure people will be using it, and you may be, either they'll screw up, they'll do something stupid, they'll decide to do a fake Michael Schumacher interview, remember that? Oh my God. Or they'll do something clever and you'll be missing out. You know, what was I talking to a video editor? He said, yeah, it's great. He said, he has some Gen AI tool that puts all the text on. And he does it at the right timing, understands it perfectly. And any number of people have shown me, you know, the Synthesia type stuff. You know, it's really interesting. That's what you should be thinking about, is exploring how you might use it, because you will be.
Is there another question there?
I think that the key is transparency and being honest of if you are using or not generative in artificial intelligence. But do you think that mainstream media is addressing correctly the use of AI in the newsroom? Because I haven't seen like a lot of code of practices regarding AI. I mean,
it's incredibly difficult to generalize. I mean,
yeah.
You know, people, I showed you Sports Illustrated. I don't know if they're mainstream media. You know,
the BBC or other mainstream media.
Generally speaking, yes. I mean, quite impressed. Yeah.
I think they offer like, something in their website, but it's not like clear enough, or they just follow several steps, but it's not like clear enough to understand what they are doing or what they are going to address the matter.
Listen, most newsrooms are not really using it. Very few newsrooms are using it. How can I put this? What's the phrase? They're not using it pretending that it's human journalism. Okay? I think when you start pretending that it's human, then you've got a problem. If you say, here is a BBC article, and it was actually written by AI, you know, you should be honest. But I don't see much of that transgression. Where it's done, it's usually done fairly obviously. Like I was a Czech in Prague, and a Czech broadcaster or online broadcaster was using an avatar of one of their real reporters for their overnight service. But they were quite careful to make sure that she never said anything that she hadn't said during the day. It was just repeating. It's just a clever way of repeating their broadcast. You know, so I think that's quite harmless. You know, and I think generally what it raises the question of is, how transparent were you in the first place? Did you tell people that where you got that material from? Do you actually got it from social media, or you got it from Reuters? You know, did you tell people that story that we're pretending is our story, we actually saw it from a rival newspaper? Did you credit that rival newspaper? You know, so I think this idea that you have to say, I experimented with the headlines on ChatGPT to make these headlines. I mean, come on. You know, the important thing about all this idea of trust is that it's a long-term relationship of being trustworthy. And that, as you know, it can be lost very quickly if you lie to people, but you can build it up over time, and you've all done that as PSMs. And the same with this. You know, if there rings an alarm bell that you think that you're cutting a corner or you haven't checked something, then, you know, like any good editing practice, you'd say, hang on. And I do think that's a genuine concern, right? Which is basically laziness, or you could call it tech dependency. And we've all done it. I've done it. You know, back in the day, I'd be in the newsroom, something broke. Oh, it's on Reuters, great, cut and paste, ping. You know, because I trusted Reuters, you know, generally speaking, if you're in a rush. The danger is that people will just use ChatGPT. They'll say, you know, we've already got this, okay? There is a tendency amongst journalists perhaps now just to Google search something. They say, can you find out about X? Something's happening in Vigo, can you find out? Instead of ringing somebody in Vigo or talking to an expert on Vigo, you Google it. And that will and of course, we all know that Google is pretty good actually, Google search. We never look beyond the first result, and we don't ever question that result. We just do the, you know? And generally 9 out of 10 times that's fine-ish. You know, but I think that is going to be the problem with AI, or could be the problem with AI, like any other technology, that we've become somewhat complacent. And again, that's why we need to know more about this and have these conversations, and why we need to ask the difficult questions like you did, because one of the important things is not just for us as an industry, but for society to understand what the hell is going on with this tech and what kind of control do we have over it. You know, on one hand, you know, it's not just because it's my job, but I'm super interested in AI, so I do think it's significant. But I can see not just the mistakes it makes, but actually simply that it's not always going to be the solution. Journalism, especially around the world, faces extraordinary problems. It has done. You talk to people in the global south, they say, you've got a problem with AI? I've got a problem with the guy who wants to kneecap me. You know, I've got a problem with the guy who won't pay me any money. You know, I've got a problem with the, you know, rebel warlords and stuff, or cartel members, you know. You're worried about AI, you know. So, of course, it doesn't solve all our problems. You know, there's a much more fundamental shift going on around information generally, and AI is going to exacerbate many of those. But that does not mean that the uses of journalism disappear. Of course they don't. Society still needs accountability. We still want to know. We're innately curious. We're innately communitarian as human beings. And journalism has always been a wonderful facilitator of that. You know, so that's not going to go. AI is not going to kill that.
Sure. But do you think there's a difference in credibility standards between your generation, my generation, and the new generation?
Credibility standards? No, I don't. I think there was a deference. I mean, can I just, you know, to anybody under 30 or whatever here in the room, we used to be the bad guys. I was regularly told, you're a journalist, you're a liar, newspapers, you can't trust anything you read in the newspapers, that's an axiom in Britain, etc. We were evil, we were biased, we were stupid. You know, sometimes I was told how stupid I was, usually by professors. And so I think in that sense, there was obviously there's greater deference and there was less choice. You had such more restricted diversity of sources. Back then, no. I think back then they were less demanding. They bought their one newspaper, they watched their 2 TV channels, and that was it. You know, it was lovely. Information flowed down to them, unless they were super powerful. You know, and if they were super powerful, they controlled that information flow. And then your generation, that started to unwind and complicate, and that's where we're left with now. So personally, I get very cross. I won't do it now, but I get very cross about journalists my age, for example, or your age, saying it's a post-truth society. We've got to get back to the truth society. And I think, no way, you know, partly because the genie's out of the box. There are so many positive elements around the more open, democratic information environment. And of course, we know the bad bits as well, the disinformation, the conspiracy theories. But just on that, my last sentence on that is, Do you know where that comes from? It doesn't come from AI. It doesn't even come from the tech, the algorithm. It comes from people. You know, there's a news channel in the UK called GB News. It's an official regulated news channel, which regularly has conspiracy theorists on it and is utterly biased to the right. Bizarrely, it's allowed to exist. You know, in America, I mean, all right, America, I should never quote Trump, but it happens here as well. But, you know, you have politicians who are barefaced lying to us. And they've always done it to a degree. It's now become actually a tactic. We don't know what to do about that as journalists. You know, so the bad stuff is human. Tech may enable it, but we should look where the source is. Thank you.
Very briefly, if I may, because we are all over the time.
You touched upon it briefly, but I think one of the reasons that people are drawn to actually use AI in such a sort of immature manner is basically also because the business model behind journalism is sort of dead, right?
Mm.
And Vincent Bellens of Financial Times talked about it briefly at the website about there, that it doesn't get that much better if you pay like a freelance journalist in Brazil $300 to write a 3-page article about anything, right? So the reason is the economic strain as well, so we need to address that. So that's basically a journalistic problem. It's not a technological problem. It's basically a political problem because you have to fund this in a way that can exist in 2024.
Exactly. And bear in mind, you know, we always have choices about this as a society, right? Back in the day, how did journalism start? It started with people in coffee houses in London and probably Vienna and places like that, being paid to write pamphlets, slagging off somebody else, or writing a pamphlet saying, we've got a whole ship full of pepper coming in. Do you want to buy it? You know, that was the model. The model keeps changing. You know, we had this incredible post-war public service media model that was mainly arranged because of the Cold War and the end of the Second World War in Europe. You know, that's why we had this model. That's why it was so successful. And I recognize, you know, that much of my journalism is funded by advertising. Why? I mean, why would an advertiser want to fund journalism? You know, they're just trying to sell cars and watches and fridges, you know. So I think you're right. We have to face up to what is the value inherent in journalism. And I can see great work being done amongst public service broadcasters. I can see it, you know, the commercial people are trying very hard to build a subscription model where they're delivering a complete experience for people. You know, we're rebundling journalism, which is quite interesting. But we're rebundling it as a service, not as a product, and not as an institution that deserves to exist for some reason. You know, if you want to be a museum, great. Museums are lovely, but they're very prey to funding cuts and things. So I think this idea of trying to build we call themselves public service media, that's what we should be. We should be focusing much more on the service that we provide. And the service may be entertainment. It doesn't have to be worthy stuff, you know. And we keep saying that, and we don't do it enough.
Thank you all for your questions. Thank you, Professor Beckett.
Thank you so much
for your
having me here.
answers.
So nice. Thank you.
And we keep it going for the next speaker.